Andy Burnham and what kind of policies he might be announcing. And let's speak with John McTernan, former Labour advisor. John was political operations director for Tony Blair. Hello, John.
Hey, good to be on.
Yes, good to be on. So, John, what do you think is going on behind the scenes right now? You've been a political director at Downing Street. Do you think people are literally getting the call this weekend from Andy Burnham directly saying, would you either want this job or I'm really sorry you're out of this job?
Yeah, look, I think there'll be two things going on, won't there? There'll be the construction of a set of announcements, a grid of policy announcements, so that during the whole week, Monday to Friday, there'll not simply be speculation about who's getting what job and then confirmation, but there'll also be something to say on what does public control really mean? What is the fate of Thames Water? What does a council-house building programme look like? What are the first steps? And this will be ideas, announcements, some spending, I imagine, but also some pictures to go with it. That'll be going on, while on the other side of the House, there will be exactly that point, trying to construct this entire grid of over 100 appointments, not just the cabinet members, but also the Minister of State, the junior ministers, the people who are actually going to do the work of every department. That's a lot of moving parts. And there was one time when I was in Number 10 when a very delicate operation fell over, really, because somebody's name was just forgotten. The name of the post-it note had fallen down, people hadn't remembered it, and somebody got or moved out of a post accidentally. So you got to have this kind of big chart of who's doing what, and then you have to adjust it in real time, because sometimes there are conversations. Now, Andy's got so much authority, I think you either take his way or the highway.
And you're so right. I've heard that story. This is when you need magnets rather than post-it notes, don't you? You need very strong magnets and not flimsy post-it notes. But as you say, it's a huge kind of, it's like a massive kind of chessboard that you're trying to kind of move all the pieces into place. And look, in terms of these announcements, I said at the beginning of the show that the sort of debut announcements are so important. They really tell a story, good or bad, i.e. the winter fuel allowance. What do you think is the big story that Andy Burnham wants to make his debut with from Monday, Tuesday?
I think the biggest story he wants to get over is that government can act, and it can act decisively. There's a lot of, I think for the 2 years of the Starmer government, you got a very strong sense that they cared seriously about the big problems that face the country. But no one cares if you care. You care if you act. When you're in government, the contrast has to be action, action, action. So not talking about a problem, solving it. Not saying the B network was great in Manchester, but actually something solid, a policy that's got symbolic value, but also something that's got practical value. So, I don't know, bring in free bus passes for everybody in England under 25. Something that shows it's a down payment on what you're trying to build. I think that's the most important thing, is to just keep acting, and try not to be seen as just talking, because people don't doubt Andy can communicate. The question is, what's the difference he's going to make? And he's been elected as change, just as Keir was before him. And so you have to provide sort of visible, tangible change really quickly.
And in terms of, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's what people will want to see, but that sort of tangible, visible change can take time. And let's say he does want to do something like buses, which could be very on brand given the B network. People will immediately say, right, how is that going to be paid for? How does he make sure that what he doesn't start off with is just like a massive sort of shopping bill?
Oh, look, I think one thing to do is to look at Zoran Mamdani. When he campaigned and when he became mayor, he was really clear: I am not campaigning on a shopping list. I'm campaigning on three things: childcare, buses, rents. And those are three issues that touch so many lives. I think the touch points, the human touch points, has to be what Andy does.
Sure, but people will say, like, if that's great, and let's say pick those three things, but how, like, people will also ask, well, many of my listeners listening will be okay, but how's that going to be paid for?
Well, you have to pay for them with switches, or you have to pay for them with new taxes. The banks in the UK have been massively undertaxed. They got a sweetheart deal from George Osborne over quantitative easing, and there's room to take some money back from the banks. So you could announce, I'm going to levy this money, and I'm going to spend it on this. So that's one of the things they'll have been thinking about. You don't do it today. You must have been doing it in the pre-planning and what were called the access talks. When you're talking, that when you say to the cabinet secretary, these are my priorities, the cabinet secretary is meant to come back to you with, like, these are the options for doing this. And you're right. How can you fund it?
Yeah, which is the big
question.
I mean, I was speaking to somebody just 2 nights ago, and we're saying, look, his speech, the speech that he has. This was actually before he became leader on Friday, but they were saying, and look, they were somebody who was a Keir Starmer person. They were saying, look, all the mood music's been great from Andy. I can see that why people are so enthusiastic, but bringing things back into public control, that's all good. It's very popular. Water, other things, maybe some energy companies. That is going to cost a lot of money, and there's the aspiration, and look, I don't think anybody would sort of think that Thames Water or some of the other water companies are doing a good job, but there is that question, and this is what this person challenged me on and said, where to quote you, John, I remember you and me doing Newsnight with Zoe Williams years ago, and you said, was this a magic money tree?
But in terms of Thames Water, the answer is really simple. Rachel has changed the way the Treasury calculate. They don't simply have public sector net debt. They got public sector net financial liabilities. So if you took Thames Water onto the books of the government, yes, there may be a cost, a debit, but there's also an asset, and the asset gets classified. It's an asset with a revenue stream. And we know from the owners of the asset, Thames Water, they've been telling the government repeatedly, they can't obey the laws of the land and run a profitable business. So they're trading insolvent. So they're starting to define for themselves what the value of their assets are. And Liam Burnham and the Business Select Committee have done a careful examination of what happens if you take into public control, public ownership, Thames Water, and the debts don't come with the assets. The assets come, and the debts lie with the people who were foolish enough to lend money to Thames Water. It's a company which wants to be exempt from any fines for failing to meet the regulations and breaking the regulations, breaking the law.
John,
so that there are ways to do this that don't cost the public purse any money.
And given that to do something radical, money is going to have to be spent, and as you say, some money could you could tax the banks. There's talk of taxing Amazon warehouses. Yeah. There will also be having to tax people, whether it's sort of council tax or other forms of tax. Just you're a real insider. You know how this stuff works. A lot of my listeners are messaging, going, look, just be honest with us. Should we be expecting to pay more tax? Is that what's coming down the track?
Oh, look, I think what was really quite cruel about the budget last year, was we all knew that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer wanted to raise taxes. They prepared the ground for it. They even had that.
Oh, yeah, there was that speech in the morning, wasn't there?
The speech that interrupted the news bulletins. They interrupted the Today programme. What an amazing thing to do. They came and going live now and then they just dropped it. And I think the country, I think you're right, your listener's right, the country was willing to have Prime Minister and Chancellor who levelled with them and said, look, we made commitments to you. We've looked at these things seriously, but we didn't consider at the time we drew up our manifesto that there would be a president who wanted to launch an unwinnable war on Iran.
Okay, so just
there are ways, but I think
that is. So I think, look, I think that is clear, and I think that's honest from you. Although, just to be clear, lots of people asking the question, am I going to get taxed? And that doesn't necessarily mean they're happy. I mean, someone's just messaged in saying, there was that Pat McFadden message to Peter Mandelson, which got leaked, which said, it's a bit of who can we tax to pay for spending. It was actually Pat speaking a truth about what is the reality of governing right now.
It was a half truth, because much of the discourse about welfare ignores the fact that the biggest recipients of welfare in Britain are pensioners. And the biggest driver, the biggest ratchet in welfare policy at the moment is the triple lock, which has done a great job over 20 years to restore pensions to a level where people can live decently on them. But if you don't have a conversation about, we had a manifesto. There needs to be some issues which are tackled at the next election in 2 years' time or 3 years' time. That's why I think some of the thinking that's going on is, what can you do this week that shows who you are? What can you do in this year's budget that shows who you are? What can you do over the next 3 years that really builds a foundation? So look, we've done this on council housing. And then you take big questions to the next election.
Okay, well, look, John, thanks very much for joining us. That's John McTernan, former political secretary for Tony Blair.